Greetings all. Welcome to another session here of Tuzi Talks. Today we're going to be looking at a little bit of the basic components of second language acquisition. We're going to be talking about acquiring knowledge for second language use. A lot of this comes out of this particular textbook right here by Seville Troika, introducing second language acquisition. It's going to be a basic overview of a lot of the components involved in language and knowledge, the knowledge of language. We'll be looking at the components and also the use of them, and show a little bit of the differences of them, and then we'll look at basically the four skills, the receptive skills and the productive skills. Let's begin by just talking a little bit about the differences between competence and use, or competence and performance, as it would be in most other texts. The idea of competence is that you're understanding things. You can hear what somebody says and understand what's being said, or you can read what somebody has written and understand what's going on. Doesn't mean that you can produce something, but it means that you can have some form of understanding with regard to the linguistics involved. Use, however, requires more understanding and more control over the aspects, both linguistic and cultural, and also the appropriate control of those things. Many linguists will try to separate the two. Some linguists will say, really, we don't separate them. They're basically the same thing. Regardless, there are these two aspects of the components of language that we should be aware of. Similarly, when we're talking about the actual use of language, we can use language in different ways. For language students who will be involved in the academy, school, high school, grammar school, college, that type of thing, they're going to need to know different components, different ways of using the language than do non-academically bound people. So we have things like CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency for the skills and the components necessary for communicating in the academy. And then there are the BICS, Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. And they're ones that are used everywhere, even outside of the school systems. So now we look at the components of language that we need. We have your basic grammar and phonology components, but we also have nonverbal and discourse mastery skills. With regard to syntax, we're looking also at morphology, the endings on words that would be necessary. Those carry a lot of grammatical elements, so we're going to need to have a knowledge of those also. Let's begin just by looking at vocabulary. In vocabulary, there is typically the number given is 3,000 words. Most frequently used words, whether they're written or spoken, and they are slightly different, so you'll want to know what those are. And there's also the academic word list, which is a specialized list, actually lists of words that are used in the academy and some in some subset fields. And so you want to know what those are. And there's also different ways of using the vocabulary. There's interactional, where we're just trying to communicate back and forth ideas. There's transactional, where I'm trying to get something, some type of a product. So there's that element going on with regard to language. Language also, and vocabulary also, is involved with registers. Speaking with somebody at a higher register requires different vocabulary. Somebody speaking at a mid-level or a low level, or we could say a vernacular versus an academic, whether you're talking to the president of the principal of the high school, or whether you're talking to the lady who works in the cafeteria, and you may have different registers for things like that. You're also going to have slang, words that are quote-unquote not acceptable, but they're used in the vernacular. And then we have nonverbals, whole bunch of nonverbals, and we'll look more into those a little bit later. Things that tell you what's going on without actually using words. We also have different knowledge types that students are going to need to be aware. They're going to need to know about the linguistic world. They're going to need to know about all the linguistics of things, the components that are all there. They're also going to need to know about what's going on in their given community, their society, their environment. So they have to know about that world, and then they need to know about strategies. Okay, we've got the world, we've got the language, and how am I going to combine the two? How am I going to get to the stuff that I need? Well, I need to have strategies in order to do that. Some metacognitive ideas, for example. Some of the components that are involved here. Take a look at morphology. Again, morphology are the endings or the changes within a word that designate that it's a new word type or that it's a new time. Two basic types here are derivational. That's basically making new words. We have the word drive. We had an R at the end. It's now driver, right? We've changed it from a verb to a noun. It's a new word. Okay, you make new words with derivational inflections. With inflectional morphemes, these are ones that change person, that change time. Talk, talks, boy, boys, that type of thing. You're changing the time or you're changing the person. And so that's morphology. You learn a ton of things by understanding morphology. You'll learn a ton of things if you can master taking a noun and making it a verb, or taking a verb and making it a noun or an adjective. So you can have one word like education, and you can make it educate, educator, educating, educational. All those are those derivational endings that we can have our students understand and master those. They're going to have great success. Move on to syntax here. With regard to syntax, there are a number of things that teachers ought to know, obviously that students ought to know. What types of order is involved with regard to the language that students are learning. So language order will be important, especially for some languages, whether it's subject-verb-object, subject-object-verb, or verb-subject-object. So, for example, in English, it's SVO, subject-verb-object. We also have subject-object-verb in such languages like Japanese. Associated with that, since it's object-verb instead of verb-object, we also have changes in things like prepositions. In the U.S., we have prepositions, or dare I say prepositions, because they're up front. We go to the bank. In other languages, they are not prepositions, they're postpositions, because they don't go to the bank, the bank to. So their marker, their preposition, their object marker in this case is going to be at the end of the sequence, not at the beginning. So you're going to have differences in order. You're also going to have differences with things like singular and plural. Some languages have it, some languages don't. So you need to be on the lookout for that. Other languages have masculine and feminine and neuter. Other languages don't. For the most part, English does not have any separations between these, although there are some derivational endings that do. So we need to be on the lookout for that. There are others that use it all over the place. So just got to be aware and know what those components are. Beyond morphology and syntax, we have non-verbal structures that are part of the communications that are going on. We have things like gestures. We have things like eye contact or no contact. We have the distance that you have between people. How close do you get? How far back do you stay? That's going to be an issue. Time will be an issue. You know, are you allowed to be late, or do you have to be early, or you have to be right on time? And that's going to impact communication, entering into that other world. Odor may play a factor. Some cultures like natural smells, other cultures don't. They prefer perfume. It's going to play a factor. Touch. How much are you allowed to touch or not touch in a given culture? Your facial expressions, is going to play a part. Your presence. And what I mean by that is, how loud are you, your presence, when you come in? Are your clothes loud? Are you loud? And would that be accepted in the culture? For many people traveling overseas or living overseas, they will say that quote-unquote Americans are loud. And it may be that we don't recognize that other cultures aren't that way. Again, living in Japan, I could easily tell who was a foreigner because they would get on the train and they would be loud, especially living up in the Tokyo area. And so they would identify themselves, as opposed to most people who will get on the train and be quiet. They're not going to create a presence. Those elements are going to have an impact on how language is used. Finally, there's discourse mastery. How well we master the ability to be involved in a discourse, whether it's things like interrupting or disagreeing or agreeing or asking or praising or accepting praise. All of these these functions of language are different in different cultures. And for someone who's going to be using language, they're going to have that knowledge so they can understand how to use language in that given culture, in that given language. There are also cohesive devices, the things that stick everything together. Some might call them logical connectors, when you're adding to a conversation, or when you're pulling back, or when you're doing the opposite. In writing, these are often used. These are these connecting words that connect ideas, things like however, or in addition, or also, or be that as it may type of thing. And you're going to want to know what these are. You have to collect these so that you can use them and use them appropriately. There are many of them that are out there. So we have all these different components. We have vocabulary, morphology, syntax, nonverbals, and we have the discourse analysis. But at the same time, now that we have them all, we have to be able to use them. We use them receptively by hearing or seeing something, and we use them productively by things that we say and write. And so now we're going to do a quick review of the 4 skills that are basically called here. We have your receptive activities, which is basically listening and reading. In the process of listening and reading, you're going to be using gestures far less, but they may still be involved in the reading or the listening or the watching if you're going to be doing things like AV things. These processes, reading and listening, require both top-down and bottom-up processing. Now, typically, what people try to show you is to begin with bottom-up processing, the inductive instead of the deductive, and that's fine. Me personally, you should use both because both are going to help you decipher what's going on. And with reading and listening, or watching in this case, you're going to need to have those skills. There are 6 abilities involved in reading, according to Grubb, and that's auto-recognize, vocabulary and structural knowledge, discourse knowledge, world knowledge, analysis skills, and metacognitive monitoring. So there are a lot of things that are going to be going on. Auto-recognize, you know this from when you learn to drive, when you learn to ride a bike. That there are things that you have to do, and you're physically, consciously thinking about them initially, but eventually they become they're on auto cycle, they're on autopilot, and you just can do them automatically. There is the knowledge of the vocab and the structure that you're going to have to know. Again, you want to put that into already know this, put it in the background. Discourse knowledge, world knowledge, analysis skills. We've looked at all these already. And these metacognitives. How can I figure out what's going on? How can I aid myself in understanding what the conversation is with these strategies? So those are the 6 abilities that are involved in reading. Actually, they're involved in many things in addition to reading. Reading is also going to be different. As we said, BICS and CALP are going to be different depending on the purpose that you're going to be involved in this reading, listening, watching activity. So it's going to require, for example, different vocabulary. Academic vocabulary is generally more professor-ese. These are longer words that say the same thing. At this point in time is the same way of saying now. Yes, we don't have any information at this point in time. We don't know, not now. Vocabulary is going to be different, so your students are going to need to know. If you're learning a second language, you're going to have to know what these different vocabulary are. Different deciphering skills requirements, because again, you're going to have different vocabulary, longer vocabulary. The skills are pretty much the same. I would have to disagree with Civil Troika. The skills are pretty much the same, but the use of them are going to be different. You may have different syntax because you're dealing with, again, the academy versus the non-academy. You may be listening, when you're listening for personal versus listening for academic, you're going to have differences as well. Differences in the amount and style of content. Differences in interruption. You're watching TV because you're having a good time. There's going to be more things going to be interrupting you as opposed to sitting in a class or listening to a lecture like you are now. There's usually fewer things around that are bothering you. Fewer things around that are trying to take your attention away. And of course, there's going to be different vocabulary that's involved as well with regard to listening. You go into the academy, you're going to be going above the 3,000 word mark, whereas in normal conversation, you're going to be safe around the 3,000 word mark. So, there'll be differences there. Those are receptive activities. In the productive, now me speaking, me writing, are going to have differences also. And some of these differences, again, are going to be vocabulary. If I'm going to write for the academy, I need to know their vocabulary and be able to produce it. So a little pushed out production here with regard to this type of thing. But it's going to be different vocabulary. You're going to have different deciphering skills because you now need to encode stuff to make sure that it says that what you want it to say. Again, different syntax requirements. For speaking, there's different pressure. For listening, for watching, you can take it in. If it's recorded, you can watch it again and again and again and prepare what's going to go on. With writing, you can prepare what you're going to write. In speaking, you don't have any time to prepare. Okay? You have to speak and you've got to be able to provide. So all the components that we were talking about earlier, you need to not only have all those things, you're going to be able to use them at a moment's notice. So it's definitely more difficult to speak because you have that added pressure to communicate. It also has a different format, obviously. There are different formats for personal and for academic. In a more formal setting, there'll be more pressure. In a more formal setting, there'll be more a more stringent format for communicating. Intimacy is going to be different as well. In a more formal setting, obviously, there's less intimacy involved. You're going to have different types of illocutionary speech acts, things that you want done. In a personal setting, you're going to be more free to give out illocutionary acts that have greater force than you typically would in a more formal setting where you're speaking to a larger group, or you're speaking to colleagues, and you may want to be encouraging them to do things, but you generally have less control at that end. You're going to have different interactions. You're going to have different interactions in a personal setting than you would in a formal setting. Whereas in a personal setting, you may engage more in communication, learning strategies, or you may want to do things like circumlocution. Whereas at a more formal setting, you may be more reserved. You may be in a classroom and not understand something, and rather than raise your hand and get involved in some circumlocution type of activity to figure out a word, you may just write that word down. You might just write that phrase down, and after the class, you go up and talk to the teacher. There are going to be different interactions that are going on, different approximations. You may go through different topic avoidance activities, different ways of noticing the pulse of what's going on. So there are different things that are going on with regard to public speaking and writing and private speaking and writing. Right? Academic style speaking and writing will be different from the informal. That's all I have here with regard to the components and the activities that you're going to be doing. It's basically an overview of the major components and a quick overview of some of the differences that you may encounter as you're looking at both the private and the public, the academic and the non-academic, the BICS and the CALP, as it were, of activities. If you have any questions, certainly give me a call. If not, give me a call. Drop me a line below here, and if not, I'll talk to you.